Hello and welcome to Album. I'm Julie Kellner. We're visiting this home construction site to illustrate a simple point. We spend our entire lives surrounded by wood. Whether you live in the inner city, the suburbs, or out in the country, virtually all of our homes include wood in some part of the construction process. It's interesting to note that while we are now coming to the close of the 20th century, we're still using wood construction techniques developed in the 19th century to hold the roofs up over our heads. This is the subject of our story, the simple 2x6 and the countless millions just like it which are used by the American construction industry every year. You see, this 2x6 has an interesting story to tell, one filled with adventure, wilderness, exploration, wealth, hardship, and greed. Ancestors of these simple pieces of wood helped shape American communities as our country pushed westward. This 2x6 represents a world of hard work, entrepreneurial spirit, fabulous wealth, and contentious litigation. This 2x6 has history, a history which helped make Duluth what it is today. We have to go back quite a few years before there were 2x6s and other standard sizes of dimensional lumber. For hundreds of years, people used large timbers, even whole trees, to construct their homes. This changed, however, as wave after wave of settlers streamed into the Midwest and West, populating cities such as Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. Carpenters and contractors were trying new and faster ways to build homes, and in the 1830s invented the balloon frame. Instead of intricate notching and joining of timbers that required skilled hands and years of experience, carpenters only required standard sizes of dimensional lumber, the 2x4 for example, a hammer, saw, and lots of nails. It was an immediate success and fueled an unprecedented demand for lumber. And there to meet this demand were apparently limitless acres of virgin timber. Tall, straight-grained trees growing across the northern lands of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Lumbermen moved into Michigan, Wisconsin, and by the 1880s into northern Minnesota. These men represented companies like Merrill Ring and Weyerhaeuser, intent on harvesting the vast stands of white pine to meet the seemingly insatiable demands of a growing nation. Timber cruisers went in first to estimate the quantity and quality of the wood and look over the lay of the land. After the cruiser came the lumberjacks, the sawyers, undercutters, swampers, teamsters, road monkeys, cooks and cookies, foremen, clerks, barn monkeys, icemen, and all the other workers needed to harvest the tall timber. The stuff of legend and mythology. Their work was the hardest, the dirtiest, the grubbiest, and the meanest. Newcomers and old-timers alike. They worked in the winter and waited till spring to take a bath. No liquor, no women, just hard work, 6 days a week.
The essential methods of getting into the woods and cutting and getting the logs to the skidways did not change much in the 19th century. It was still necessary to have an advance crew put up the bunkhouse and stables before the crew of loggers arrived, to have roads cut from the camps into the area for logging, to have trees marked that were to be cut, to ice the road so that the great loads could be hauled by the fewest number of horses, to throw hay on the hill roads so that the load would slow down and not run over the horses, to have the logs cut into convenient sections and hauled to the skidways, there to be loaded by loaders and jammers for the trip to the landing, ready for rail or lake transportation. Grace Lee Newt, 1942.
Moving the logs to the sawmill presented special challenges for logging companies in northern Minnesota. Many valleys were too steep and rivers too wild for traditional log drives. This was the era of logging railroads and the Lake Superior log raft.
We built this railroad for our logging operations and never obtained any special right-of-way rights because in those days no one bothered with such things. All the log haul was done during the summer, that is, from break-up in the spring until freeze-up in the fall. The main haul locomotive was a Brooks rod engine weighing 40 tons. We called this locomotive the four-spot, and it could easily haul 10 full-loaded cars per trip. Since the locomotives were powered with steam engines, we used wood entirely for fuel. This wood was cut along the right-of-way. We used every kind of tree available, including spruce, pine, tamarack, popple, and birch. G.H. Good, 1952.
Merrill Ring owned the Split Rock Lumber Company. They would bank the logs at Split Rock, and in the spring a boom was formed with logs chained end to end, and the logs rolled down the bank into the boom. The tug Gladiator would hook onto it with another tug pushing from behind, and tow it to Duluth and up the St. Louis River to the mill. It was always a thrilling sight to see the raft coming up the lake with the cap whistle blowing.
By 1894, there were 15 mills in Duluth, with annual capacities ranging from 5 million to over 45 million feet of lumber. Logs were coming from the South and North Shore, and from inland in both Wisconsin and Minnesota. These were aggressive lumbermen. The Merrill Ring Company, for example, brought big capital, big ideas, and a big reputation to Duluth. It also brought 17 rail cars of up-to-date equipment and machinery from its properties in Saginaw, Michigan.
Between the ends of Rice's and Grassy Points, which bound the bay and are less than 3 miles apart, stand 7 mills with a total annual capacity of 210 million feet, all shipped by water to eastern points, through the canal at Sault Ste. Marie. Of all the big companies that operated and shipped in this year, Merrill & Ring turned out 40 million feet of lumber, C.N. Nelson 37,500,000 feet, and Duncan Brewer 26,400,000 feet. D.A. Woodbridge 1895.
Dear Mr. Merrill, the mill started up on the 18th of April and has cut to date 6,500,000 feet, being an average of a little over 216,000 feet a day. We had a very good class of logs, so now have on the docks some very nice lumber. Prices are not of the best, and there is some difficulty at disposing of stocks at any place near their right value. Carnegie and the big steel men in the east have increased wages 10%, and in this part of the country, people are looking for dollar wheat, so with everything else advancing, lumber must necessarily have its turn. Tiff Jerome to Thomas Merrill, 1895.
Up through 1891, most of the lumber manufactured here was marketed largely in western Minnesota and North Dakota. In 1892 and 93, however, large sales were made to the east, and from then on, the large fleet of lumber carriers would depart loaded with lumber bound primarily for Eastern and European markets. The Duluth market itself was significant.
This town has withstood the panic very well. There has been a fair amount of building going on this winter, and now things are quite lively as the mills, iron mines, and vessel interests employ quite a number of men. Tiff Jerome to Thomas Merrill, 1895.
By 1894, 3,700 men were employed by Duluth sawmill operators, making a product valued at nearly $4.5 million. population exploded as immigrants flowed into Duluth to work in the mills and the mines of the North Country. In the mills, they became the pony, head, and tail sawyers, store managers, filers, planermen, trimmermen, engineers, edgermen, cut-off sawmen, firemen, setters, carriage riders, edging catchers, lumber straighteners, graders, and sorters.
The first summer I worked in a planing mill, taking away behind the machine. The lumber was placed in trucks and shifted over to boxcars that stood close to the siding. We worked 10 hours a day, and for 2 weeks we worked until 9 at night. We worked a 10-hour day, 6 days a week, but had Sunday free. We were paid 21 cents an hour. That gave us $2.10 per day with 60 cents deducted for room and board. That gave us $1.50 a day net, as there were no deductions those days for Social Security, union dues, or income tax. William Heimbach, 1900.
Business peaked in 1899 when almost 500 million feet of lumber was shipped. From 1891 to 1924, more than 7 billion feet of lumber valued at $130 million was shipped out of the Duluth Superior Harbor. To cut the logs, bring them here, saw, and pile the lumber, it cost more than $80 million. When we consider that more than 90% of this was paid out in wages, provisions, and other supplies, including feed for thousands of horses and food for men, it's easy to understand the important part the lumber industry played in the development of the city and surrounding countryside.
Cyril Fortner operated a small sawmill on Garden Lake, just out of Winton, Minnesota, which, as they say up there, is close by Ely. But Uncle Cyril kept this sawmill going into the 30s and possibly even the 40s. But it was quite a relic, to be frank with you. His log storage was strictly in the bay. He had what would be called normally a mill pond, but it was just a part of the larger lake. Log storage, water storage, was superintended by good old Uncle Cyril himself, using a small steam-powered boat. The next scene of significance is the polers feeding the jack-ladder. Now, the jack-ladder is an incline with a chain with dogs sticking up on it, sharp dogs, that picks up the log from the water and carries it up the incline. The log deck is the area that the logs are rolled onto the flat area at the head of the jack-ladder, and a weight there turned to go through the saws. The mill utilizes what I believe was called a shotgun carriage. The carriage is handled by 2 men in this case, and each one of them has the tools it takes to change the thickness of the board that's coming off the log. The signal is given to them by the sawyer, and in our case, the sawyer is Uncle Cyril himself. It's hard to pick up all of his signals, but if you're careful, you can see that he's showing them 1 inch, 2 inches, turn the log, various things like that. The steam kicker helps in turning the log. They could be extremely fast, and in the biggest sawmills, they were so fast that the carriage riders had to be really on the ball or they'd get knocked off. They trimmed and edged planks or cants coming off the saws are carried on a green chain out to the yard, where they will be loaded or carried to the stacks, the drying stacks in the drying yard. Green lumber is very heavy, and it comes off the saws in a variety of qualities. This mill operated in a period before the many precautions are taken to make things safe for workmen. The federal laws evolved in the 30s and were refined ever since then. But in those days, between all of the belts driving different machines, the possibility of having some of your clothes get caught on one of those was pretty definitely there. And there were no hard-toed shoes, no special glasses for avoiding sawdust in the face. And falls were quite common because it's very apt to be a little damp around the working areas. There were a tremendous number of accidents.
Small sawmills like Cyril Fortier's were common across the North Country in the 1930s and 40s. Operating primarily in the warmer months, these mills relied on timber that was either overlooked by earlier logging operations, was too far from a rail line, or was considered too small and not worth the effort by the larger companies. Men like Cyril Fortier were gleaners, cutting and selling their lumber locally since they couldn't compete with the larger bandsaw mills on the Iron Range and in Duluth. Uncle Cyril's sawmill may have been the last steam-operated mill in northern Minnesota, but the traditions it followed and the tools it used are still part of North Country life. We are here at the Hedstrom Lumber Company in Grand Marais, Minnesota, to see how it's done from this log to this board. Joining me now to explain the process is company president Howard Hedstrom. Tell me a little bit about how long this company has been in continual operation.
Well, the business was founded by my grandfather back in 1914, and he had a large family, and there were six, my father and five of his brothers that carried on the business with my grandfather, and eventually by themselves, and then after they've retired over the years, it's now in third generation ownership with myself, two brothers, and a cousin.
Now maybe you should just walk us through the process. What happens first when a log comes here? What's the first thing you do with a load of timber? Well,
first, this is a white pine log. We saw 6 different species, white, red, and jack pine, spruce, balsam, and aspen. When a truckload of logs comes to the mill, it's scaled. That is, our scaler will come out, he'll measure the amount of wood on that load, the size of the logs, the quality, and the logger, whoever the seller is, will get paid on the scale of the quality.
How do you determine quality?
Mostly visually, looking at whether it's got rot, it's got a bad face, maybe it's had a scar over the years. If it's real limby, big limbs, of course, cause big knots. That causes degrade in the lumber and make it less useful or less attractive. Just the many different factors. Also the species, different species have different values.
Do you know right away what it is going to be used for, if it's going to be 2x4s or something larger or another product?
Generally, pretty much it's determined by the species of the wood. This is a red pine board, and the red pine generally goes into the 2x products. The white pine will make 1-inch boards out of, or a product called molding grade, which is a little heavier product if it's clear lumber. So the spruce is we make all dimension products, which is the 2-inch material. The aspen we generally make into a 1-inch product. So it's generally by species, some market conditions, and how the log opens up and what you actually find inside the log will also determine what we make out of it.
Where is your market? Where do you sell lumber?
Mostly in the upper Midwest. All lumber is a commodity and transportation sensitive, so it ends up in Duluth, in Wisconsin, maybe into Iowa. But generally in this market area, and we sell through distributors. That's our method of selling, or through brokers, which a truckload will go to a distribution yard and then be parted out and go to an actual lumber yard where a contractor or a homeowner would maybe buy this piece.
So once a log is ready to go into the sawmill, what sort of processes does it go through in the mill itself?
The first thing that happens is it goes through a debarker, where the bark gets taken off. Part of the log, where it's not round, ends up being chipped for paper making, and it has to be bark free for that. And then it goes the larger wood goes to what we call our head saw, which saws, squares up the lumber and makes actual lumber, or to our scrag saw, which is just the same sort of process, a little different. Goes through the mill, gets made into boards, goes through an edger to take and smooth up the edges, and then the trimmer. It gets graded at the mill and then separated by grade and width, generally. From there, it gets some stickers placed in the lumber to provide airspace. It goes into the dry kiln where the lumber gets dried, and then it goes to the planer where the actual finishing operation is done, where the edges are smoothed up. It could either end up square like this 2x6 with little rounded edges, or if it's paneling, it'll have that paneling detail on it, or siding, or whatever the product may be.
Going back to the kiln, why is it important to dry wood?
Well, wood shrinks when it dries. So when you're making a 2x or whatever it is, you don't want that shrinkage to occur after you build with it. Also, if it's wet enough, it'll grow mold and things either in the distribution process or in the home, which would be bad. And we have to meet the grading rules, which are moisture content. Also, some of the products will end up in furniture or that sort of thing, where you have to go through a glue line, and that has to have very tight moisture specifications.
So if something is going to be a 2x4, it would go into the kiln larger?
No, it goes in, it's sized. This starts out in the old days, this is a 2x6, which is actually 1.5 by 5.5. In the old days, the sawmill would saw 2-inch by 6-inch, and then that extra was called shrinkage and planing allowance, to allow that board to finish up at those dimensions. Nowadays, with the sawing technology, we saw it on the sawmill 1.75 by 5.75. So we're making better use. A log like this today in our mill will produce more lumber than it would have back at the turn of the century.
Other changes?
Mostly mechanization. We get, in the old days there was lots of manual labor. Today there's more automation, more things done by machinery. We just don't have the weak mind, strong back theory anymore. It's people work smarter, and machinery does the back-breaking work.
So how dangerous is this industry still?
Well, there's a lot of machinery. There's still a lot of handwork, and it's a dangerous, on the scale of things, a dangerous business. We do have a very active safety program, and for the type of operation, I think we do a very good job.
About how many board feet come out of headstones every year?
This mill in Grand Marais will saw about 22 million board feet. In our mill and two harbors, we'll do about 12 million board feet this year.
Thank you very much for this fascinating tour.
You're welcome.
Well, you saw it, folks. This log to a 2x6. This board is probably destined for somebody's home, maybe a remodeling project or new construction. You know, it doesn't look like much, but this board really represents an industry and a challenge to balance the management of our natural resources with creating economic growth and jobs. Really, it's a legacy left by an earlier era.